The presidency, author and intelligence expert Melvin Goodman describes the history of the relationship between the White House and the CIA from the Truman years through today. Goodman explains how President Truman's quiet intelligence arm became a politicized source of covert actions around the world, from the Bay of Pigs invasion to the Iran Contra affair. This event was hosted by the National Archives at Kansas City. It's about an hour.
Thank you, and good evening, and thank you, first of all, to Dale and to Gayla for the invitation to come out here, and all the wonderful hospitality, and the chance to get to the World War I Museum, which is a remarkable museum. And it's been an extremely pleasant couple of days. This is a great topic to deal with because it's controversial from the outset. No matter what I say, I think it's going to be controversial. But let me start with some controversial remarks that others made before I get to my own. And I would like to start with Senator Frank Church. Senator Frank Church from Idaho, of course, was the chairman of the Church Commission. And when the Church Commission investigation started, he made a remark that I think was unfortunate. He called the CIA a rogue elephant that was out of control. That's entirely wrong. If the CIA were a rogue elephant out of control, the problem would be easy. Because you would just get it under control somehow, and a president should be able to do that. But the president has given all of the missions, and quite a few of them were regrettable, that the CIA carried out came from the White House. So the CIA is quite obedient to authority, quite responsive to what a president wants, and if you look at the various covert actions over the years, and I'll be discussing some of them, these were directed, conceptualized, orchestrated, endorsed by presidents of the United States. Now, when we get into the controversy of the CIA itself, I think it's important to understand that when presidents come to Washington, they fall in love with two institutions. They fall in love with Camp David, and they fall in love with the CIA. And when they fall in love with the CIA, unfortunately, it's with the clandestine aspect of the CIA. It's clandestine operations, and it's covert action that they fall in love with. Harry Truman was an exception to this, and I'll discuss that in a minute. When presidents have had trouble with the CIA, it's been over intelligence analysis, where I spent 24 years as a Soviet analyst. And the remarks of a couple presidents will, I think, demonstrate what I mean. One of my favorites is Richard Nixon. When Richard Nixon sent Jim Schlesinger out to the CIA to become a director in the 1970s, he made it clear to Schlesinger that he was going out there to clean up the place. I happened to be at the other end of that because Schlesinger was playing a role in politicizing intelligence. Nixon clearly said to him that the CIA is nothing but a sanctuary of a bunch of Ivy League intellectuals who don't like me very much. The typical Nixon observation. And he also referred to them as a bunch of clowns. And so what he wanted to know was, what in the world do all those clowns do out there anyway? And it was Schlesinger's job to settle this problem. And one of the first things he did was to bring together all of the Soviet analysts. I was a Soviet analyst at the CIA, and he said, I want this agency to stop screwing Richard Nixon. We knew this was going to be a very difficult period. Fortunately, he didn't stay around very long, so he didn't have a great impact. The other president who I think has made fascinating remarks about everything, but also the CIA, was, of course, Lyndon Johnson. And what Lyndon Johnson liked to do is explain to people who came to the White House, particularly close friends who came from Texas, what it is that intelligence analysts do at the CIA. And he had his own interpretation of that. And one of the ways he expressed what CIA analysts do was to compare it to when he was on the farm and he had a favorite cow named Bessie. And he would get Bessie in her stanchion, and he would pull up a stool, and he would get a pail of milk from Bessie. But if he wasn't paying attention, it often happened that Bessie would take her shit-smeared tail and run it right through that pail of milk. He said, that's what intelligence analysts do. I'll have a great program, I'll have a great policy, and they come along with their analysis. And I think what both Nixon and Johnson were talking about was the CIA criticism in its intelligence estimates of what we were doing in Vietnam. Vietnam is an unwinnable war. Harry Truman did not fall in love with the CIA. He may have created the CIA, but he did not fall in love with it, and by 1963 he wrote a very important op-ed describing the problems of the CIA, which is relevant to today's situation. It was clear after World War II that we were going to have a central intelligence agency for two very good reasons. One was Pearl Harbor. In the case of Pearl Harbor, we had broken the Japanese military code, so we knew that the Japanese were going to war against the United States. We knew they were going to break relations with the United States, indicator of war. We knew that the embassy had been directed to destroy all of their sensitive information in Washington, another indicator of war. This information did not get to the right people. If it had, on any short list of possible targets, you would have to include Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. So this is a tragedy that did not have to happen in the way that it did. So 6 months after the war ended was when he sat down with intelligence types, most of them from the Office of Strategic Services, and began to talk about the need for an intelligence agency, never discussing the possibility of covert action or even clandestine operations, but putting the emphasis on intelligence analysis and clandestine collection of intelligence, which he thought were two legitimate functions for an intelligence agency. So 1947, when you get the National Security Act, which really is the act that still governs the national security architecture of the United States. In fact, you could argue it's time to go back and re-examine the National Security Act. But remember, it created the National Security Council, as we know it today. It created the Department of Defense. It created the United States Air Force as a separate service, and it created the Central Intelligence Agency. And the director of CIA was also the director of Central Intelligence, and here was one of the flaws in this piece of legislation. Because even though the director of CIA was supposed to be the director of all of the intelligence agencies, he had no authorization for personnel, for budget, for tasking, even to be the central intelligence figure for the President of the United States, the way, say, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the central military figure for the President of the United States. And that is a problem that still has not been corrected, even with the intelligence reform of 2004. 16 years later, when Truman was living out here in retirement, he wrote an op-ed piece for the Washington Post, highly critical of what the CIA was and what it had become. So what I want to deal with is not only that 16-year period, because you're talking about the presidencies of President Eisenhower and President Kennedy, but to look at the presidents that followed these two presidents. Truman's concerns, which I think are highly topical today and highly relevant today, were with what the CIA had become, which was not part of his original concept. In other words, when he was thinking of the CIA, he referred to this as the quiet intelligence arm of the President of the United States. He wanted a place where he could go outside of the policy arena, that is, outside of the State Department, outside of the Pentagon, outside of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where he could get intelligence analysis that wasn't grinding some policy axe, that was supposed to be objective or balanced. What he saw that the CIA had become over the 16 intervening years was a very subversive organization that he said had become much too noisy in terms of all of the news that the CIA was creating, unfortunately, and was putting too much attention into covert action. And he said something that is very topical for today, which is he didn't want the CIA to become another Pentagon. And one of the arguments I've been making over the years, and certainly in the book I did on the CIA, The Failure of Intelligence, was the CIA has become essentially a paramilitary organization, which I think is not what Truman had in mind. And the one thing that Truman understood that presidents after Truman did not concern themselves with is that if you have an organization that conducts covert action is part of policy. So already you've tainted the intelligence, you've tainted intelligence collection, because covert action is in support of policy and comes directly from the White House in support of a very specific policy. So what happened in the 16-year period? Eisenhower is an interesting study in this regard because when we think of Eisenhower, we think of all of the warnings he gave about overuse of the military, which were valid warnings and remain valid warnings to this day. You're all familiar with the military-industrial complex observation in the farewell address of 1961. He gave a very important warning in a speech early in his first term in the Cross of Iron speech that he wrote himself, warning about bloated defense budgets that would not allow the United States to do what it needed to do in terms of infrastructure, domestic economy, educating our children. And there was a great line in it that he wrote about when we're spending on defense, and particularly when we're overspending on defense, we're spending the brains of our scientists, the sweat of our laborers, and the hopes of our children. And he warned against this. And he also warned that any era or period of global war or permanent war, such as the one we're in now, would lead to definite limitations in personal liberty. And you could argue that's exactly what's happened over the past 10 years. But nevertheless, Eisenhower is the president who started the CIA down this trail of covert activity. And when you run down the list of covert actions that he endorsed that came out of the White House, in every case they left the United States in a weaker strategic position than existed before these covert actions were conducted. 1953, the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Iran, Mossadegh substituting the Shah of Iran. An issue that remains in our bilateral relationship with Iran to this day. The following year, Guatemala, and the work that the CIA did working with the Guatemalan military in creating the K unit, which was responsible for all sorts of horrors and nightmares in Guatemala against the indigenous population. The decision to assassinate Lumumba in the Congo, even though it wasn't carried out by the CIA because a Belgian-sponsored group got to Lumumba before the CIA could get there. Think of the successor to Lumumba, who was Mobutu, probably the worst tyrant in the modern history of Africa. Cuba, even though Eisenhower didn't endorse the Bay of Pigs, and when it was brought to him by Nixon in a very emphatic way, and supported, of course, by John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, the brothers who ran state and CIA, Eisenhower considered the Bay of Pigs to be madness. But the attempts to overthrow Castro began in the last year of the Eisenhower administration. And finally, Indonesia, and the great crimes against the Indonesian civilian population because of the feeling that Sukarno was too far to the left for American interests, particularly economic interests. So these were not only covert actions that were strategic nightmares, but they were supported by a committee that Eisenhower appointed in 1954 under General Doolittle, the Doolittle Commission, which endorsed this kind of repugnant activity. And that's exactly what Doolittle called it, saying that now they were up against an implacable enemy, the Soviet Union, that was seeking world domination, tremendous exaggeration of the Soviet Union, even in the 1950s. Doolittle wrote a report that basically said that ends would justify the means, and the Americans would have to learn to understand this kind of repugnant behavior. And frankly, if you fast forward to more current time period, when you think of Dick Cheney's remarks about the dark side, they come from the same kind of thinking and conceptualization that we saw from the Doolittle Committee. When Kennedy came in to office, he had none of the experience, of course, that Eisenhower had. He was somewhat uncertain about the plans that were given to him for Cuba that included the Bay of Pigs, but he did call Eisenhower at the farm. And instead of Eisenhower saying or giving a sense of all of the qualms and hesitations he had about the Bay of Pigs, unfortunately, he advised Kennedy that when you have an exile force that you're training, if you don't put them to use, they're eventually all going to go home and begin to talk about an operation that never took place. And the United States could ultimately be embarrassed by this. So Kennedy went ahead with the Bay of Pigs, even though he had been misled by some of the briefings he got from CIA, that there were people around him, including former Secretary of State Dean Acheson and also Arthur Schlesinger and others, who warned him against the Bay of Pigs. And as we all know, this was what the CIA called in their IG report, Inspector General's report, the perfect failure. Bay of Pigs was just a nightmare. It's kind of interesting that here it is more than 50 years later, and there's a federal court of appeals, this was just last month in May, upheld the CIA in their efforts to hold on to documentation from the Bay of Pigs that we still don't know about, that still hasn't been declassified. So we're still living with this great fear of Cuba and great fear of Castro, and still unwilling to declassify documents. So Kennedy was responsible for that nightmare, which could have undercut the Kennedy administration from the very start, and if it hadn't been for the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy's image would have been much different. But Kennedy was also responsible for the overthrow of the Diem government in Vietnam, which strategically was totally flawed, because one of the reasons why we wanted to move Diem out of the way were the clandestine reports the CIA was collecting legitimately, that Diem was looking for a way to open up negotiations with the North Vietnamese, which we were not in favor of. But in moving Diem aside, and he was killed in the process, you really ended any possibility of having a legitimate government in Vietnam that we could work with. So when you look at Vietnam as an unwinnable war, which it was, like Iraq, like Afghanistan, this is something that we knew from the outset. Now, when you march through the presidents after Eisenhower and Kennedy, the die was cast, in a sense. The model of covert action, the model for clandestine operations, the model for political assassinations, for regime change, all this had been set. So when you get to Richard Nixon and the operation against Chile, again, like the Guatemalan operation, which was encouraged by United Fruit, which was the largest landholder in Guatemala. In Chile, you get economic interests, again, like ITT and mining interests that were in favor of overthrowing the leftist government, the democratically elected government of Allende. And in response, you get Pinochet and that dictatorship, which brought more horrors to Chile. In fact, when Richard Helms, the CIA director, left the White House with the mission that he had been given by Henry Kissinger, he was stunned by the authority that he had to conduct covert operations in Chile. He ended up lying toward before a congressional committee and was fined for that, but he was somewhat shocked by the authority that he had. Nixon was followed by Gerald Ford. Ford's contribution to the CIA was extremely unfortunate because Ford introduced a concept for politicizing the intelligence of the CIA. He introduced the concept of Team A, Team B. Team A was, of course, the CIA and the political analysis of the CIA. Team B was a team that the Ford administration wanted to introduce, and I have no trouble with that as a discipline for challenging the analysis of the CIA, but this was a group of neoconservatives, handpicked by the White House, led by a Harvard professor, Richard Pipes, who was very anti-Soviet, General Danny Graham, who was anti-Soviet, Paul Wolfowitz, who was anti-Soviet, who tried to push analysis of the CIA to the right, ironically at the very time when the Soviets were realizing that the missile race was getting them nowhere and it was time to seek another approach toward arms control. So the Team A, Team B concept, which was fostered to a great extent by two names that are very familiar to you, Dick Cheney, who was the chief of staff for Jerry Ford, and Donald Rumsfeld, who at that time was the youngest Secretary of Defense since the creation of the National Security Act and the Department of Defense. And ironically, he became the oldest Secretary of Defense in our history when he served for George W. Bush. Ford, of course, was followed by Carter. Carter was extremely suspicious of the CIA. His Vice President Mondale was too. In fact, this was a period that Carter used, a 4-year period, where we did not send soldiers into combat. And until the last year of his administration, there was really a walking away, or at least a great reduction in covert action. That all changed in 1979 when, of course, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, when I think we reacted very vigorously and probably unwisely. I think it was Napoleon who once said, when your adversary is doing something stupid, leave them alone. Well, the Soviets were certainly doing something stupid. Unfortunately, we replicated all of that, and now we're finding our way out of Afghanistan. But we started covert action in Afghanistan before the Soviets invaded, and I've always been convinced that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter during this period, was hoping to introduce covert action as a way of bringing the Soviets into Afghanistan. And I've often felt that the Soviets were convinced that with the United States being forced out of Iran in 1979, that we as a country would not accept that strategic setback and would find a way to get back. And the Soviets felt it might be a good idea to be positioned in Afghanistan for at least a period of time. But in any event, that period, a 10-year period, was a nightmare for the Soviet Union, building up to 100,000 troops, and we repeated everything they did. Again, over a decade, 100,000 troops, trying to create a central government in a country that's never had a centralized form of government. Carter was, of course, followed by Reagan, and you probably had as much harm done and misuse of the CIA by President Reagan than any other president, with the possible exception of George W. Bush, and I'll come to him in a minute. When you look at Iran Contra, and it has always been a subject of conjecture about how much Reagan really knew and understood about Iran Contra, but the fact of the matter is these were Reagan's people. Bill Casey, the director of Central Intelligence, who was the first director ever put on a president's cabinet, which is something Truman never would have approved of because that's a policy organization and the CIA was not supposed to be part of policy. It was led by people in the National Security Council, including John Poindexter, the National Security Advisor to the President, key officials of both the National Security Council and the CIA, all of whom were pardoned later by George H.W. Bush in his last month or two in office, so we'll never really get a full understanding, but clearly this was Reagan ignoring the laws of the land. In the first case, selling arms, first out of Israeli inventories and then our inventories, to Iran, a state that was involved with acts of terrorism, which was a violation of law, and then using the profits from those sales to provide money to the Contras, which was a violation of the Boland Amendment. So when you think about impeachment, particularly based on not following the law of the land, there were clear grounds for impeachment. And I think if the country hadn't gone through the nightmare of the Nixon process, there may have been some people who would have considered impeachment. But Reagan was much too popular for that, and the country didn't want to live through that kind of experience so soon again. Reagan was also responsible for appointing the most ideological CIA director in the history of the CIA, and that was William Casey. Casey was a campaign director for Ronald Reagan and did a wonderful job as a campaign director, but he certainly was not suited to be a CIA director. In fact, in the 1970s, when I worked at the State Department and Kissinger came over to State to become not only the National Security Advisor, but also the Secretary of State, he was being taken around the building and he saw a plaque on one of the doors, William Casey, Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. And he said to this poor Foreign Service officer who was taking him around, how in the hell did he get in this building? He's senile. Can you do something about that? And of course, what is a Foreign Service officer going to do about William Casey as an Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs? But Casey was gone within a period of months after that. With George H.W. Bush, you get not only the appointment of Robert Gates as the CIA director, even though Gates was the deputy to Bill Casey. So when you look at all of the politicization of intelligence, which led to the failure to anticipate the decline of the Soviet Union, you have to point to Casey and Gates, who were the filters for intelligence during this period. This is why I left the CIA in 1986 to go to the National War College. Reagan tried to make Gates a CIA director in 1987 when Bill Casey died. But the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, David Boren, senator from Oklahoma, called Gates at his home that night after the first day of testimony and said, "The committee doesn't believe you in terms of your expressions of knowing nothing about Iran Contra." And of course, Gates was lying at that time, and he had to pull his name out of the process. But in 1991, he had laundered his credentials and convinced Boren that he would be a good director, and Boren guaranteed to the White House, that's a Democratic chairman guaranteeing to a Republican White House, the system is not supposed to work that way, that he would get him through, and that's exactly what he did. When you get to Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Barack Obama, I think you get three presidents whose appointments to the CIA and directors of CIA were extremely questionable. I have a lot of questions with regard to Bill Clinton's stewardship of national security in general. Bill Clinton was responsible for abolishing ACTA, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and I don't think it's properly understood how closely ACTA and the CIA worked in terms of providing verification and monitoring of arms control agreements. So with abolishing ACTA, which the right wing wanted in the 1990s, led by Jesse Helms and Newt Gingrich, and Clinton caved into that pressure, we lost a very important tool for conducting arms control and disarmament policy on an international level. And when you look at Clinton's appointments, Jim Woolsey, George Tenet, the same George Tenet who told George W. Bush that it would be a slam dunk to produce the intelligence to support the decision to invade Iraq. And remember, George Bush did not want that intelligence to convince himself. He wanted that intelligence to convince us. Bush was dedicated to the idea of using military force in Iraq, and I don't think it really mattered what the intelligence said. But if you go to the memoirs of Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, all of them argue that it was intelligence that convinced them that we needed to take action. That is just total nonsense. The intelligence was totally flawed, but people who knew that there was also intelligence that made it clear there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So when you get to George W. Bush and you get really to some of the worst aspects of CIA conduct in the field of clandestine operations. And of course, I'm talking about the secret prisons, the renditions policy, which was really a kidnapping policy, detentions, torture, and abuse. All of these things were part of what Dick Cheney called the dark side in U.S. clandestine operations. Barack Obama comes into office with very little background in national security affairs. That was always the weakness of the Obama candidacy. It's not that he had not been in Washington that much to be a political participant in how Washington operates on a political level, but he had never really demonstrated an intense concern with national security policy. I always thought from the start that he was somewhat intimidated by the military and the Central Intelligence Agency. His appointments, when you look at his first national security team, were extremely weak. Leaving Robert Gates at the Defense Department made no real sense, and I think was caving in to not only the right wing, but conservatives within the Democratic Party, appointing Hillary Clinton to the State Department with no real experience as an international steward of American national security policy, appointing a three-star retired Marine general Jones to be the National Security Advisor, which only lasted about 18 months because he was totally unsuited for that role, and putting in Leon Panetta, who has been a wonderful civil servant over the years, but was a rather tired civil servant by this time. It was not an effective director of the Central Intelligence Agency. I think he was captured from the outset by the operational side of the House, and he also carried out the White House mission, which was started by George W. Bush to weaken the process of oversight within the CIA. And remember, this, the role of the statutory inspector general of the CIA was an extremely important position. It was created by one of the reforms after Iran Contra, when the CIA for the first time got a statutory IG as opposed to just a regular inspector general. In other words, this was an inspector general appointed by the President of the United States, which gave that individual a tremendous amount of clout. And when you think of the work that was done by the statutory IGs over the years, particularly the reports on 9/11, a lot of the reports that we haven't seen yet, the reports that dealt with detentions policy and renditions policy, work that fed into the Senate process, which produced a 6,000-page report that unfortunately the CIA is dragging its heels on in terms of sanitizing for the American public. I think we're entitled to see that report, and I think Senator Feinstein should fight harder in getting it released, and I think Obama should allow whatever redactions are needed, but get that paper out. We need to see what happened in our name during the global war on terror. The problem in presenting this talk the way I have, it has been highly negative. And I'm not saying that there weren't successes, but I think the point I wanted to make is the one of presidential misuse of the Central Intelligence Agency. There have been good directors. General Smith for President Truman was a very good director. John McCone was a very honest director, and when he thought he didn't have the ear of the president, he resigned. He went back to California. Bill Colby tried to expose a lot of the excesses of CIA behavior, and Admiral Stansfield Turner was a very good director of CIA, but someone who was very new to the Washington community, and I think never felt really comfortable as a CIA director. And there were presidents who used CIA intelligence very effectively. And actually Richard Nixon, who was so critical of CIA analysis, used that analysis on two very important occasions. One, to start the arms control process in terms of the SALT agreement in 1972, and the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, also in 1972. And without the CIA guaranteeing the verification and monitoring of those treaties, which the CIA did guarantee, something that made Helms very nervous. I was working on SALT at that time, and he called us in and said, remember, only politicians can verify an agreement. He didn't like the idea that we were referred to as the verification panel. But basically, we were taking on the Pentagon, which was against arms control, and arguing that these agreements could not be verified. So in terms of ABM and the SALT agreement and very important weapon systems, it was the intelligence of the CIA and the intelligence community in general that was essential to get arms control underway. And of course, when you think of the most important strategic initiative of any president over the last 40, 50 years, it was the strategic triangle of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger that would allow the United States to build better relations with both China and the Soviet Union than they had with each other. And it was CIA intelligence that provided the impetus to suggest that we could do this. And as a result, the Soviet Union would have to engage us, which they did in terms of the Treaty of Berlin and the arms control agreements, and we would end up with very good bilateral relations with both of them. So the CIA can be effective as a support instrument in this area. In terms of what needs to be done, because I'm running out of my time, I think we could do ourselves a lot of good by going back to that op-ed that President Truman wrote in December of 1963. The warning about covert action, the warning that covert action is policy, and covert action, and therefore can taint clandestine collection and even taint intelligence analysis, that the CIA should not be a second Pentagon, it should not be a paramilitary organization, and it would be necessary to return the CIA to the role of the quiet intelligence arm of the president. This would mean demilitarizing the CIA, which needs to be done, which is something that Obama addressed over a year ago when he gave a very important speech at the National Defense University, in which I thought he made it clear that he wanted the use of the drone turned over to the military. And we have reduced our drone missions, but they're still being run by the Central Intelligence Agency, which is an important paramilitary activity. But we need to demilitarize, we need to decentralize. It might not be a bad idea to have a statutory term for a CIA director, as we do for the FBI director, so that each president doesn't feel he has to have his own intelligence director, which we've been doing for the last 30 years. And finally, what I would like to see is separating intelligence analysis and clandestine activity into two separate organizations. They should not be under one roof. So going back to President Truman would be a good way to start. So with that, I'd like to hear your comments and questions and criticisms. I think we have a lot to talk about. So it's usually hard to get that first question, so I usually jump to the second question.
Could you talk a little bit about the division of responsibility between the National Security Agency and the CIA? And we've been hearing a lot about the National Security Agency's collection of information as though they are what you seem to be referring to as what the CIA should be doing, that is strictly collecting information.
Yeah. The CIA was created by Truman openly in 1947 as part of the National Security Act. The National Security Agency was created secretly by Truman in 1952 with a very specific mission, and that would be their role in communications intelligence and signals intelligence. So they had the function to intercept all communications and all signals abroad. It was strictly a foreign mission dealing with foreign intelligence collection, with no responsibility for domestic function any more than the CIA was going to have any jurisdiction in domestic matters. But the National Security Agency is essentially a collection agency where they have gotten off the rails, and it's kind of interesting that the director of NSA, when they got into domestic surveillance, which I think is a violation of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, and there's at least one federal appeals judge out there who agrees with that position, was when they started the massive surveillance. Yet when Michael Hayden was nominated to be the CIA director, and I went down to talk to some staffers about this issue, the question of his role at the NSA and massive surveillance and the metadata that we've seen never came up in the confirmation process, which was indeed unfortunate. But their focus is a very narrow focus on intelligence collection of signals and communications intelligence. And when you look at the body of law that protects intelligence, they get protection in the law that no other intelligence collection gets. So whatever you want to think about Edward Snowden, of course, he's a very controversial character. He has violated very serious laws, which makes his return to this country and how that is conducted an extremely difficult process because these laws will be pursued in terms of violation of signals and communications intelligence. He is in a lot of trouble, as we all know.
Several years after the 9/11 attack, there was a reorganization of intelligence agencies where there's now one director literally supposedly overseeing absolutely everything. How has that impacted the CIA?
Well, it's clearly weakened the CIA, and the intention was to weaken the CIA. You're talking about the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004 that created the Director of National Intelligence. Now, to a certain extent, you could argue that the Director of CIA, who up to that point was also the Director of Central Intelligence, wore these two hats, but it was too much responsibility for any one individual. And I said at the outset, one of the flaws of the 1947 National Security Act was it did not give the CIA director, who was the Director of Central Intelligence, any authority in terms of personnel or budget or tasking, moving people around as missions change. But when they created the Director of National Intelligence, he didn't get that authority either because the Pentagon would not allow it. Before he could even be sworn in, Donald Rumsfeld, who was very adroit in terms of understanding the bureaucracy. In fact, when you put Rumsfeld and Cheney in a room together, I mean, they could control a bureaucracy like no other pair of individuals could do. So before the Director of National Intelligence, the so-called National Intelligence Czar, got his desk at the new building, Rumsfeld had already created the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and made sure that all of those responsibilities dealing with military intelligence stayed with the Pentagon. And when you look at the entire intelligence community, 80 to 85% of the budget and personnel belong to the military, whether they're civilian or military. It's a military operation. That's why a CIA outside of that military process was so important. And if you look at the directors of national intelligence, with the exception of one individual, a retired Foreign Service officer, John Negroponte, who served for a while and realized he had no authority whatsoever, so he resigned to take a position at state. All of the directors of national intelligence have been retired generals and flag officers, admirals. And I would argue that the military, which does a lot of things extremely well, one of the things they don't do well is strategic intelligence. And the real problem we have in terms of intelligence analysis is strategic intelligence, long-term intelligence. That is not their thing. The military does worst-case analysis, and that's another reason why Truman wanted a CIA. So it has not been a measure that's led to any improvement in terms of the real problems of the intelligence community.
Recently read a book called The Brothers about Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, which seemed to set the table for the CIA and foreign policy for the rest of the century. My question is, how influential were they on Eisenhower, or was Eisenhower the one that was calling the shots? It was unclear from that book, at least, as to...
Yeah, it was. When you were dealing with Eisenhower and strategic concerns and the use of the military, it was Eisenhower's policy. John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, Richard Nixon as vice president, did not have great influence over Eisenhower. Eisenhower had an uncanny sense of how to control the military. In fact, one of the best warnings he did not put in writing, but it was on his way out of the White House in December, January of 1960, 1961, when he was ruminating with a group of his close advisors, and he said, God help the United States when the person who sits in this chair after me does not know how to deal with the military. And Eisenhower did. So all of the efforts that Allen Dulles made and John Foster Dulles made to bail out the French at Dien Bien Phu, Nixon was prepared to use nuclear weapons to do it. Getting involved in Vietnam, which the Dulles brothers and Nixon wanted to do. Bailing out the British and the French and the Israelis in the stupid attack to prevent the nationalization of the Suez Canal. Doing something about the Soviet invasion of Hungary. You know, all of this criticism of Obama about Ukraine. Look at Eisenhower in Hungary in 1956. Eisenhower had no interest in any of that, and Eisenhower accepted a stalemate in Korea, which a lot of presidents probably would have been unable to do. So it was his policy, and the Dulles brothers and Nixon were not that influential. He relied on, actually, military officers to a large extent who he knew from World War II, particularly Matthew Ridgway. That was a very close relationship, the one between Eisenhower and Ridgway. But on covert action, for some reason, because I think it could be done, as he thought, cheaply and not too noisy and not too visible, and because Iran appeared to be a success in 1953, he did follow their lead on those issues, and I think serious mistakes were made. So you have a dichotomy here. You have, on the strategic side, it's clearly Eisenhower's policies over the 8-year period. The way he controlled the defense budget, for example, and kept the lid on defense spending. But on covert action and clandestine operations, they were influential, because I don't think he paid as much attention to that as he did to the strategic matters.
Kind of a two-part question. On the intelligence leading up to the Iraq War, you said it was flawed. My understanding was that even Saddam's own generals believed that he had WMDs and that we were getting intelligence maybe from some of those people, which would seem to me there's nothing we could do better to make that intelligence better. And also you said there was other people who knew the intelligence was flawed. Could you clarify why they didn't, who those people were, why they didn't speak up, or what happened with that?
Well, first of all, there were, one of the things that Saddam Hussein did extremely well, and this was a great strategic deception, was, what worked against him, was convincing international communities to some extent, and his own people, including general officers, that he had weapons of mass destruction, particularly chemical weapons, that he was willing to use against his own people. Saddam Hussein never thought he would use these weapons against us. He was more concerned about an internal revolt than he was anything else, particularly after the flawed war against Iran over the 1980s, when not only he had chemical weapons, he used chemical weapons. But the CIA had all sorts of collections that made it clear, including from his son-in-law, who defected, went to Jordan, and then was lured back into the country and killed in return for giving up this information, who made it clear he had no weapons of mass destruction, that they were destroyed either by his own forces or by the U.S. military during the Desert Storm operation, or in the wake of Desert Storm. So you had the former foreign minister, Ali Sabri, who said this, and the CIA ran an excellent operation in Iraq that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, sending Iraqi Americans, particularly those who had worked in scientific areas, to go back to Baghdad, an important series in Iraq, and talk to relatives who were still working in important industries in Iraq, where they could determine what Iraq had in the way of strategic weaponry. And they all made it clear they did not have this weaponry. And then you had sources reporting that was based on single source reporting that was presented as sourcing that was could be supported by other sources or other reporting. And even someone like Colin Powell, who went out to the CIA to write that speech that he gave at the UN, was lied to by the Deputy Director of CIA, John McLaughlin, in terms of how good this sourcing was. So the people who knew and the people who wanted to learn knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction. And the inspectors who went over there, people like David Kay and others, they were shocked when they found out there were no weapons of mass destruction. But clearly that was a total misuse of intelligence. It was total politicization of the intelligence product. So when you look at the estimate of October 2002 that the CIA did, and the white paper that the CIA did, which they were prevented by their charter from doing because it was the unclassified version of the estimate that went down to Capitol Hill right before the vote on the authorization to use force. There were 28 allegations. All of them were wrong. And that was the very product that was used to write Colin Powell's speech that he gave at the UN the first week of February 2003, 6 or 7 weeks before he went into the country.
Well, did the president have any better information than Colin Powell had, or he believed the same?
I don't think Bush cared at all about the evidence. He wasn't looking for evidence. He was collaring people from the very start, people like Richard Clarke, and it's in his book, soon after 9/11, to find out what Iraq's role was in the 9/11 attack. And not only was there no role whatsoever, but Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden hated each other. They were rivals in terms of the Islamic fundamentalist activity in the Middle East. They weren't allies at all. And this was known to Bush, it was known to Cheney. But you know, Cheney's position was the 1% factor. If there's a 1% chance that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, we have to take action. Well, this is justification for what Cheney wanted to do. We wanted to punish someone after 9/11. There was no doubt about that. There was no punishment to be dealt to Afghanistan because there were no strategic targets. There was no real terrorist movement by then because al-Qaeda had been routed from the country, very effectively, by the way, by the CIA and the military over a 2-month period with 450 people. That's why this war is such a tragedy. After December 2001, we should have turned the keys back over to the country. The various ethnic groups, the Tajiks particularly, who were so effective in getting the Taliban out of Kabul. And we didn't have to be there for another 12, 13 years with all the losses that we've suffered.
You spoke in your opening remarks about the CIA not being a rogue agency, and that the things that have happened is because they've been misused by the presidents. It's my perception that, at least over the last few years, they've gone before Congress and repeatedly misled the various committees. And I also feel that the committees have really practiced a hear no evil, see no evil approach towards the CIA. So I think, in addition to the president's misusing the agency, there's also been a lack of supervision by Congress. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Well, there's no question in my mind that the oversight process has been compromised. Now, the shocking thing to me is that in 1947, you create a secret organization, the CIA, with no oversight whatsoever. You don't have a statutory IG, you don't have an intelligence committee. It took 30 years and a series of abuses before people like Senator Church and Congressman Pike, who just died in the last 6 months in the House, the Pike Commission, realizing that you needed oversight committees. So for 30 years, the CIA was basically out there on its own hook with the support of the White House with no responsibilities to the Congress. For the first 15 years, I would argue, up through David Boren and the confirmation of Robert Gates, I think the Intelligence Committee, particularly in the Senate, was an elite group. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, when I testified against Gates in '91, they were, the powerhouses within the Senate were on that committee. And it was bipartisan, and you could tell it was bipartisan. But that was the turning point. And now, under both Democrats and Republicans, it's been, I think, a cat's paw for the White House. Finally, Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's done a terrible job up to now, is finally exercised because of this 6,000-page report, because she knows the CIA, as you say, was lying to the Congress. Now, I'm not saying that the CIA didn't try to play sleight of hand with the Congress, because they often did that to protect policies that they were given by the White House. But Feinstein was in a position to know what all of these obfuscations were. And I think she should still be engaged with the White House to get that report out. It has to come out. We're entitled to see it. There are violations of law took place, and we have to know what they were, because they were conducted in our name as the United States of America.
On the Benghazi thing, I know Hillary Clinton in her new book is saying she didn't want to get involved in the politicization of the issue, but it seems like Mike Morrell, who I saw him, I think it was on 60 Minutes, talking about how he prepared the talking points or whatever, but it seems like he was heavily involved in politicizing that whole Benghazi issue from the beginning. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the important thing about Benghazi, and I think this was a misunderstanding from the very beginning, Benghazi was not really a consulate platform. I mean, we had a consulate there. It was very small. But Benghazi was really an intelligence platform. The CIA presence in Benghazi with a very specific mission was probably 4 times as big, at least 4 times as big as the State Department presence. All the other foreign communities had taken their consulates out of Benghazi because of the fighting and the instability in Benghazi. The CIA was there to buy weapons back that had been sold to Gaddafi over the years that now were in the hands of these various militias. And it's interesting how many times the CIA has to go out to buy weapons back that never should have been provided in the first place. So when the plane flew out of Benghazi with the survivors of those attacks, from the work I did, 24 people on the plane were CIA and 6, I think, were State Department. So to me, the CIA has gotten off the hook for the security. There was a security problem in Benghazi. There's no question about that. Why was the ambassador, Chris Stevens, a very popular young ambassador in the Middle East, in Libya, why was he even in Benghazi? What business could he have been doing in Benghazi? To what degree was Secretary of State Clinton interested in showing we were successful in Libya when clearly the overthrow of Gaddafi has become a nightmare, totally counterproductive? I believe there was some politicization of those briefing points. And it's kind of interesting that Susan Rice, who's now having trouble giving a description of what happened with this trade-off between the American soldier and the 5 Taliban, is the same one who bollocks the briefings about Benghazi on the talk shows because people like Hillary Clinton ran because they didn't want to go on national television in the wake of Benghazi. Benghazi was indeed a nightmare. And I think the people who were there knew it was a terrorist attack that probably had nothing to do with this anti-Muslim film that was making the rounds in the United States. But it's unfortunate that it's being so politicized. I don't think anyone is really trying to look at Benghazi for what really happened. It's being used as a partisan weapon in this case, and that's not good for any of us.
I'm told I'm to be the last questioner.
Make it a good one.
2. We negotiated that I get 2.
You're last. You have 3.
Actually, I had about 10, but we'll just I've agreed to settle for 2. So we'll do the easy one first. Would it be your position, looking at the Central Intelligence Agency over the years, and for purpose of discussion here, assuming that it's got 2 operations, the Intelligence Division and the Operations Division, would it be your position that it shouldn't have an Operations Division?
Well, I think the advantage of the Directorate of Operations is the ability to collect clandestine intelligence. And I would continue to support that. And I'm thinking of some assignments that I had where I benefited from intelligence collection that was clandestine. For example, when the Egyptians decided to kick out the Soviets in 1972, which I thought was a signal to us that they were indeed serious about an agreement with Israel, but Henry Kissinger didn't act on it. So the intelligence was spot on. And the important thing to keep in mind about intelligence collection, because the United States does a tremendous job of intelligence collection, when you look at all of the intelligence failures, going back to Pearl Harbor, before the CIA was even created, the collection was always good enough to prevent us from being wrong. The errors were always made at the analytical level. A lack of imagination, a lack of resourcefulness, just a lack of rigor. So 9/11 was an intelligence failure that could have been prevented. The collection was there. The Iraq War, the collection was there. The decline of the Soviet Union, the intelligence was clearly there, but Gates wouldn't allow the analysts to do what they needed to do with the intelligence. So the collection is quite good, and I wouldn't do away with that. What's the hard question?
The hard question I'll get to in a moment. First of all, I'd like to say that I've read some of the portions of some of the books you've written, and I recommend it to everybody in here. They're just excellent.
And I did not have anything to do with you saying that.
That's correct. That's correct. But I figured I'd shine you on a bit before I ask you the last question, which is this. Oh, I don't know. I noticed you commented on Edward Snowden that he is in big trouble and has violated many laws. And I also noticed that you made a comment somewhere along the line that some of the things that were going on were violations of the Fourth Amendment. Is that a fair statement?
Certainly.
All right. If not Edward Snowden, as we know him, at this point in the life of the intelligence community, did there need to be an Edward Snowden to expose what's going on in the intelligence community?
Definitely. And now, there is a contradiction between being right and being legally designed. And even Edward Snowden, in that interview he gave to Brian Williams, which I think all of you should try to see if you haven't seen it, parts of it were fascinating, made it clear that you can be right, that doesn't mean what you're doing is legal. And I think Snowden knows full well that he violated laws, but he also knows what happened to someone like Thomas Drake, who I know fairly well, who was a whistleblower at the NSA and was accused under the Espionage Act and could have spent the rest of his life in prison before a judge threw every account that the government threw at Snowden out and lectured the government that this is not the Soviet Union, this is the United States, and you can't conduct yourself this way in my court. So Snowden, the sad thing about the Snowden case is he's safer in Russia than he is in the United States. And that's an indictment of us. I think what he has revealed to us is something we needed to know. And in some ways it should be a wake-up call about the excesses of the intelligence community. And the reason why I'm critical of Obama is when he came into office, he very early on said, I'm not going to look back, I'm going to look ahead. Well, you have to have accountability for the excesses that took place, particularly under George Bush for 8 years. And this is what we don't seem to want to do. And I'm not convinced that the reform process we've put in place for the NSA and this massive surveillance and the metadata is really going to be effective. And clearly, if you look at the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, that's been essentially a kangaroo court, a mouthpiece for the administration. So a lot needs to be done. And if it weren't for Snowden, we wouldn't be having this discussion. The president wouldn't be answering the charges that he's had to answer. The Congress wouldn't be proposing reforms. And judges wouldn't refer to this activity as Orwellian. So we owe Snowden something. But he faces a serious legal situation. I even question whether he should have taken an interview with Brian Williams. That right now it should be, he has a very good lawyer representing him. Plato Kacharis in Washington, who handles very big cases. So we know, or at least I think we should know, that some dialogue has started. I feel he should be brought back, that there should be some kind of plea bargain, because we have no idea what he took with him. I've talked to people who were involved with damage assessment for this case, and they do not know what he has. And he doesn't have anything now. So I think it's important to sit down with Snowden at some point to find out what's going to be compromised.